If you watch my channel for a while, it should come as no surprise that you can be tracked via your mobile phone. But precisely how it is done has been changing, and in 2022 we will refresh the methods used based on the new technologies introduced as well as existing popular methods still in use. Some of these methods may not be as effective depending on another element, and that is your identity. Although many of these methods will work on all kinds of phones, some may indicate the presence of a phone but not specifically identify that it is you. I'll try to make it clear as I discuss each category. I will also indicate who the source of the threat is in each category, and we will group into threats from big tech, government, hackers, and any third parties. If you watched my similar videos before, you will find new information here since lots of things have changed in 2022. Stay right there to get some learning time. I'm on the platform Odyssey.com, and I'm now one of the top creators on there. In case I get deplatformed, please follow me there using the link in the description. My company provides privacy solutions like Bytes VPN, Braxmail, and now our newest product is the Brax 2 Privacy Phone, which protects your data on mobile. Brax 2 is now available on Amazon and is also on my app, BraxMe. The links are in the description. In order to explain the issues clearly, I'm going to split the discussion of phone tracking into three groups. GPS sensor-based tracking, or tracking which utilizes the GPS sensor on the phone. Cell baseband modem tracking, this means using the cell radio portion of the phone. And more obscure methods called proximity tracking, which uses other radios and even non-radio options. Some of these threats do not apply to what I call de-Googled or privacy phones. These include Android open source project phones with no gaps like BraxOS, LineageOS, Graphene, and Calyx. It also includes all Linux phones. And I will state as well if these devices are free from the threat. When I'm referring to the GPS sensor being used for tracking, I'm not necessarily stating that this is your GPS sensor. However, the location tracking originates from some GPS sensor at some point, and then later on it may not need that, as related location information is now stored and called up via other means. The first threat on the phone is the feature on the phone I call Wi-Fi scanning. Phones may have a feature to turn off something called Wi-Fi scanning, but this is not necessarily the same thing. Generally speaking, Wi-Fi scanning is done by Apple and Google, and this uses the GPS heavily, and this capability cannot be turned off. Wi-Fi scanning is what Apple and Google does to search for the location of every Wi-Fi router in existence. Each phone scans the airwaves for a router, and then when it finds one, it records the GPS position, the signal strength, and the MAC address or the serial number of the Wi-Fi router. This then gets reported to Apple and Google to populate the database for Wi-Fi triangulation, which I will discuss later. Basically, each phone is a slave of Apple and Google and are being used to acquire information for their use. The problem is that your phones are obviously identifiable. Apple and Google phones have an Apple ID and a Google ID, so clearly it is within the capability of these tech companies to not only build the Wi-Fi triangulation databases, but also to identify who provided the data. And thus, they are able to locate you 24/7 since Wi-Fi scanning is a continuous process. This part of the collection is closed source. It's a black box. It's being done, but there's no way to turn it off. Apple admits it cannot be turned off. Google Android has a checkbox to disable Wi-Fi scanning nowadays, but it is not entirely clear if this is the same thing. Wi-Fi scanning on the open source Android simply means a probe for Wi-Fi routers nearby. It doesn't have any related code for sending the data to Google. Google used to collect this information via Street View cars, but why waste resources driving around collecting Wi-Fi data when every Android can collect the information for them? So that's what they do. Threat analysis. Wi-Fi scanning. Apple and Google threat only, not a threat on the Google privacy phones. What is this Wi-Fi router database for? The one built from Wi-Fi scanning data. The Wi-Fi router database is used to track locations of all devices that have Wi-Fi. For example, a Mac can be located even though it doesn't have a GPS. Same with a Windows computer. The browsers can locate any device that has Wi-Fi. It does this using the technique called Wi-Fi triangulation. Even though a phone can already be tracked using a GPS, the phones are located when indoors using the same Wi-Fi triangulation. You see, GPS does not work indoors. The tracking is done by, again, repeating the same Wi-Fi scan, finding the MAC addresses of routers near you, and the signal strength. Then, using some formula to compute relative strengths of the signal, a device can be triangulated to within 6 feet. Now, the word triangulation suggests that you need 3 routers to find your phone, but in reality it only takes 2 routers to get a position fix. The good news about Wi-Fi triangulation is that it is enabled by Apple and Google for third-party use, but only with permissions. Apple and Google do not need to locate you via Wi-Fi triangulation, but they can provide that information to third parties if you authorize locations. In theory, you cannot be tracked using Wi-Fi triangulation if your phone doesn't have Wi-Fi. But today there's no such phone. All phones have Wi-Fi and you cannot turn it off. Wi-Fi as used in triangulation is a passive process. The triangulation is done in receive mode only. Therefore, airplane mode has no effect on it. Again, the only way to turn off Wi-Fi triangulation is by permission. Threat analysis. Wi-Fi triangulation. Google and Apple always knows your location on Google Android and Apple phones. Any app given a location permission. Advertisers that gain locations from the apps. Potential threat to all smartphones with Wi-Fi. Let's assume for a moment that you use some apps that ask you for location and you give it. The problem is, without your knowledge, the location data is now transferred to third parties that are connected to the permission app. A specific example of this is the Weather Channel app. This app will seem to legitimately require location data in order to provide the weather info. But the effect of this is that the advertisers on the app now gain the location info. You might think that the advertisers are there just to pop up some location-specific ads. However, this is not just the case. The phone identifiers are combined with location data. Phone identifiers such as the Google ID, Apple ID, advertising ID, IP addresses, timestamps, and other information known to the app that might identify you, like an email. Then this is aggregated by the advertising wholesaler, and then this is separately sold as bulk data. That's how they make the money. The effect of this data is the ability for third parties to do geofencing or identifying locations of specific phones at specific times. This may not necessarily reveal an actual person, but will specifically point to the presence of a specific phone at a specific place and at a specific time. The limitation here is that this data does not work without permissions. So this is more of a tech normie threat. Someone educated in privacy would be very restrictive with location permissions, and this will shut down rogue apps from stealing this information. Unfortunately, the majority are tech normies, so it is a threat for the majority of people. Threat analysis. App location tracking. Apps with location permissions. Advertisers reselling location data. Potential threat to all smartphones using apps with location permissions. An IP address in itself would only provide a general location like a city, but it would be enough to identify a small group of devices. But today an IP address can identify you and even typically arrive with your location info, particularly if you're on Wi-Fi on your home network. This is connected to the apps that collected location data previously. These companies also collected IP addresses with locations and then once again sold this to location companies. This gets packaged into what's called a reverse IP lookup database. So the IP addresses and location data pairs are stored. You can look up a location based on the IP address, captured once again from the various apps that reside on your phone with location permissions. Now let's say you use a VPN at home or a VPN router like I do, and then I forget and an app captures a location. It will not capture the correct IP address since a VPN IP address is shared by many people. This then cancels out this threat. But if you took no precaution, then simply making your IP address known, because you do not use a VPN, will reveal your location, typically within about 200 feet. Threat analysis: IP address, any app or website, any platform that subscribes to a reverse IP lookup database. Threat to all phones on Wi-Fi, less of a threat on cell data. AirTag tracking is specific to those with iPhones, so if you do not have an iPhone, this is not a threat for you. This threat is about the phone, not about the AirTag. The way the AirTag infrastructure works is as a mesh network. Each iPhone listens for AirTag beacon signals. When it hears one, the iPhone will send the AirTag data, which is usually encrypted, but with the location of the iPhone that captured the AirTag data. This has multiple implications. First, all iPhones near a particular AirTag is also discovered, and then the locations of each iPhone are sent to Apple, thus geofencing users near the AirTag, as well as getting their exact location in relation to the AirTag. The location may come from GPS or from Wi-Fi triangulation. Then this works, strangely, when the phone is turned off. As long as the iPhone has some power left, the iPhone then becomes an AirTag and then is tracked once again by other iPhones that are powered on. Threat analysis: AirTag tracking, iPhone users, Apple, not a threat on the Google privacy phones. Find My Phone is more of a heavy threat from Apple than it is from Google. And the reason for that is that Find My Phone, just like Wi-Fi scanning, cannot be turned off. Each Apple device emits a regular beacon that identifies its location and the device identifier. This identifier is connected to the device and not the user, although it is obvious that Apple knows which user is currently assigned to the device by its Apple ID. As much as the average user thinks that they can turn Find My Phone off, the reality is that the owner of the phone can choose not to receive updates of the phone location, but it doesn't stop Apple from continuously pinging the device. There is no other manufacturer that is doing such an insidious tracking and in such a direct way. Threat analysis: Find My Phone, iPhone users, Apple, not a threat on the Google privacy phones. The next series of threats relate to the cell baseband modem or the radio that can talk to the cell towers in your phone. Cell tower triangulation. In general, if you're on 4G LTE or older technologies in other countries, the phone is located mostly by its selection of a cell tower. And if another cell tower is nearby, then the strength of the signal of the neighboring cell tower will give some indication of your location within the cell area. This is generally not very exact. It can perhaps isolate your location to a 1/2 mile square area, which is a large area in a big city. However, this can be enhanced when some special tech is used so that some model phones can be made to send their location based on GPS position. So this is kind of a hybrid. But first, let me talk about 5G tracking. 5G features some advanced features called beamforming. This is more of a capability of the new upper 5G bands, which are not yet in widespread use. Beamforming allows the antenna signal to be focused as a beam to your phone. This gives the upper 5G band some extra range without increasing the transmission power. The problem is that beamforming is exact. Using software to shape the transmission signal, it can actually point to you exactly and not just that you are nearby. In theory, this could point to your location in inches. So personally, I don't get too excited by 5G. Location tracking will be on steroids when this is in widespread use. At the moment, it is not. Most 5G implementations are just multi-band transmissions of LTE, which I refer to as fake 5G. Is this threat active right now? I'm thinking that it is not yet there, but maybe I'm wrong, so perhaps an insider will let me know. The main threat from this capability comes from government. Telecommunication carriers are heavily tied to the surveillance state, and if the carrier can find you, then you can assume that the government will find you. So 5G servers will theoretically make you even easier to find. Threat analysis, cell tower triangulation, carriers and government. 5G users, upper 5G bands, are more accurately located. Threat to all phones with a SIM card. The Stingray device, or generically referred to as an IMSI catcher, is a radio device that can be used by law enforcement or built by any hacker. The device can be used to identify phones found within a given area. For example, if you're in a protest and someone with an IMSI catcher is in the vicinity, the IMSI catcher can query all the phones in the area and record the mobile subscriber identity, or IMSI. The IMSI itself will not identify the user. A secondary lookup is necessary into the carrier records in order to identify who owns the phone. However, the IMSI could be captured as a record of who was in the area. Only the government or a carrier would be able to determine the actual user identity, though a hacker can use it to see if a user has been seen before. For example, if a hacker uses an IMSI catcher to record IMSIs in Protest 1 and Protest 2, it could identify if the same people are attending the protest. This is without knowing the actual person's name. The way to eliminate this threat, by the way, is to remove the SIM card. The IMSI is in the SIM card, so if you remove it, then the identity of the phone is no longer announced. Threat analysis. Stingray IMSI catcher. Threat to all phones with a SIM card. Government. Hackers with a homemade IMSI catcher. The use of an IMSI catcher is actually very similar to a range of device trackers that I call proximity trackers. By proximity tracking, I mean that the location is assumed to be near some listening post, but without an actual GPS position. So this is a location tracking by inference. It could be combined with other data to give more meat to the information gathered. Going back to the IMSI catcher case, if a TV camera is capturing the faces of the people in a protest, and the IMSI catcher is also collecting IMSIs, then some correlation can be made between facial recognition and IMSIs. Radio-based MAC address tracking. One of the easiest ways to implement a proximity tracker is to use a radio that listens to Bluetooth or to Wi-Fi. These radios are built into every phone and usually cannot be turned off. Part of the protocol for connecting to Wi-Fi is that the phones look for Wi-Fi routers by issuing a probe message. Is my favorite Wi-Fi nearby? Bluetooth is also signaling a similar probe. Is my Bluetooth device nearby? These probes send a specific network message that includes an identifier called the MAC address. This is a unique identifier and thus can be isolated to specific phones. So here's an example scenario that's very easy to do. Have a building that has a security camera at the entrance recording every person walking in. Then, using a network listener on Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or both, they record the MAC addresses of the user's devices. Now you have a camera photo matched to a phone emission. If you have the same radio receiver at various points in the building, you can then track a person and figure out which floor he or she went to. And you have the luxury of comparing it to camera footage to actually identify a face. This is the effect of people not caring about their mobile devices. You could put your phones in a Faraday bag and that would eliminate this threat. Or you could turn the phone off. Threat analysis. Radio-based MAC address tracking. Any organization can be combined with other data like cameras. Threat to all phones with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Can be disabled with a Faraday bag. Beyond just doing probes that can be detected by third parties, iPhones and Google Android since 2020 have had the capability to detect other devices nearby, and this is done via Bluetooth. Each phone is now enabled to send a beacon announcing its identity to other phones. Now, supposedly, this is a feature activated only if you install some contact tracing app. However, the problem is that this hidden feature is now enabled and the signals detected are sent to Apple and Google. How they can be potentially used, we don't know. But always assume that if it can be used in some nefarious way, history has shown that it will be used in that way. So assume then that Google and Apple are aware of near contacts between phones in the real world. Google and Apple are already able to geofence phones in areas using the data from Wi-Fi scanning, and Apple has the additional benefit of geofencing using Find My Phone and AirTags. But this is an additional capability. You can consider contact tracing as a proximity tracking feature. You know who is close to whom without knowing the actual location. In the absence of other information, this can be used, I'm sure. Threat analysis. Bluetooth contact tracing. Google and Apple. Government access is possible. Enhance location data to show close contact. Not a threat on the Googled privacy phones. Ultrasound is a proximity tracking feature and can be used whenever the phone's microphone is active. This can be on a phone call, when talking to Siri or Google Assistant. The way this can work is that some entity, let's say a government, can have ultrasound signals emitted in various areas of a city. Ultrasound is beyond the limits of hearing of a human, but it is within the range that can be captured by any phone microphone. It is possible for secret messages to be sent back and forth between devices via the ultrasound. The beacon can also be a fixed signal indicating a location. In the past, some advertisers were using this on your TV. Sound signals were sent depending on what you were watching on TV, and that could then be captured by apps with microphone access and then sent to a central entity. The FCC banned this particular use of ultrasound. However, nothing stops a government from using this as a way to find someone. Let's say a government knows the identity of a target phone. That phone can be made to dial out, and thus the microphone would be turned on. Ultrasound signals in the area can then be heard, and that may be a location beacon. Ultrasound doesn't have to be fixed, so more advanced messages are possible. Threat analysis. Ultrasound could be used illegally by advertisers, could be used by governments in conjunction with phone hacks like SS7 or SIMjacker. Threat to all phones. The last one I will discuss is the gyro sensor on the phone. A gyro can detect changes in direction in the phone, but in recent changes to the mobile OSs, this has been limited to fitness apps given certain permissions, and the permissions are often short-term. So it is no longer a long-term threat. In theory, a continuous gyro measurement could also track location. However, since it will not work continuously now, it can only be used to detect movements from a last position. In order to utilize this data, a particular rogue app would have to be installed on the phone with permissions. Examples would be fitness apps that have some secret functions. This is less likely as a threat since there are other methods of tracking that are easier. However, a state player that's being thwarted by someone knowledgeable about mobile tech may use this as a supporting piece of technology. Threat analysis. Gyro tracking. Advanced government threat. Threat to all phones with a gyro sensor. In summary, some of these threats can be mitigated by the use of the Google privacy phone. Some threats can be mitigated by removing the SIM card. Some threats can be mitigated by not installing common apps, for example, sticking to apps from F-Droid. Some threats exist only on iPhones. However, it is clear that many threats still exist on all phones, so knowing which one can be a threat to you is important to understand. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.